My high school sweetheart broke my heart and married someone else. A decade later, he stood in front of me at a business meeting as my new boss. His eyes widened as he whispered, "It's you." I forced a smile, strictly professional. But that night, he sent me a message. I made the biggest mistake of my life. My hands trembled as I read his next words, and my heart raced when I realized what he had been hiding all these years. I was sitting in the glass-walled conference room, flipping through a presentation folder, when the door opened. I didn't bother looking up at first. It was a big client meeting, and I was expecting a team of executives. I kept my expression neutral, professional. This deal was important, and I had prepared for weeks. But then I heard his voice. Not in the casual, everyday way you hear someone speak. This was different. This was a voice that punched through time, dragging me backward, ripping open old wounds I had spent years sewing shut. I looked up, and there he was. Ilya Whitmore. My high school sweetheart. My first love. The boy who promised me forever, then shattered me into a million pieces. He was standing at the head of the table, gripping the chair so hard his knuckles were white. His sharp blue eyes locked onto mine, widening in shock. The room went silent. His lips parted slightly, but for a moment, no sound came out. Then he finally whispered, "It's you." I felt my stomach clench, but I forced myself to stay calm. He didn't get to see what this was doing to me. So I straightened my back, tucked my emotions away, and smiled coolly. "Strictly business, Mr. Whitmore." Ilya flinched, just slightly, before nodding. He cleared his throat and turned his attention to the room, but I felt it. The way he kept stealing glances. The way his mind wasn't on the meeting at all. I forced myself to focus. I wasn't the girl he left behind. I had built something for myself. I had clawed my way to this position, and I wasn't about to let some ghost from my past throw me off my game. But later that night, long after the meeting ended, my phone lit up with a message. I made the biggest mistake of my life. I stared at the screen, my hands gripping the glass of wine I had been nursing. Then another message popped up. "I need to talk to you. Please." I shouldn't have replied. I shouldn't have cared. But after a decade of unanswered questions, I needed to hear what he had to say. So I typed back. "You don't get to come back now. Not after what you did." There was a pause. The three dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. "Please, just meet me. One conversation. That's all I ask." I should have ignored him. I really should have. But I agreed. And that's when I found out what he had been hiding all these years. Ilya and I had met in high school. He wasn't the loud, cocky guy everyone wanted. He was something else. The type of person who made you feel like you were the only one in the world when he looked at you. He had this quiet confidence, this way of making everything feel important. And for 2 years, I was his world. Or at least, I thought I was. We were inseparable. Late-night phone calls, inside jokes, whispered confessions in the dark. We planned our futures together. He wanted to go to Wharton, I was heading to NYU. We talked about getting an apartment in the city, about everything we'd build together. Then, out of nowhere, he broke up with me. No warning, no explanation. Just, we need to focus on college. It didn't make sense. We had a plan. We were the plan. I was heartbroken. But I was still waiting. Still hoping. Until 2 months later, when I saw the engagement announcement in the local paper. Ilya Whitmore and Annalise Ferron, engaged. Annalise came from money. Old money. Connecticut aristocracy. Her father was a hedge fund titan. Ilya wasn't just marrying a girl, he was securing a future. He never even told me himself. It was like I had never mattered. Like I had been nothing more than a stepping stone he crushed on his way up. I fell apart. I drank too much. I stopped writing. My grades slipped. I hated him. But the worst part? I still loved him. And that nearly destroyed me. But time moved on. And so did I. When I arrived at the bar, I saw him immediately. He was already sitting in the corner, looking nervous. Good. I sat across from him, ordered a drink, and waited. He stared at me for a long moment, then finally spoke. "I didn't want to break up with you." I scoffed. "Oh, so you just did it for fun?" His jaw clenched. He exhaled through his nose. I was forced to. I rolled my eyes. "By who?" "Your parents." He shook his head. "Annalise's father." I frowned. "What?" "He gave me an ultimatum," he said, his voice lower now. "Break up with you, marry Annalise, and he'd get me into Wharton. Then he'd set me up at his hedge fund. One step away from being a partner before I even graduated." My blood went cold. I clenched my jaw. "So you sold me for a job?" "No," he said quickly. "I did it because he threatened you." The air between us went silent. I stared at him. "What the hell are you talking about?" He hesitated, then finally said, "Your dad. His company. The startup. You remember." I nodded, feeling a pit form in my stomach. He found out the investors were connected to him. If I didn't leave you, if I didn't cut you off completely, he was going to make one call and have the funding pulled. I stopped breathing. Because my father's company had gone under. I had blamed bad luck. Bad timing. A failed business move. But it wasn't bad luck. It was him. Ilya's voice broke. I didn't know he actually went through with it. I thought if I just did what he wanted, he'd leave your family alone. I swear, I didn't. I stood up so fast my chair nearly fell over. You're telling me my father lost everything because of you? My voice shook, but not from sadness. From rage. I didn't have a choice. I let out a bitter laugh. No, but I do. Ilya looked at me, desperation in his eyes. Please, just let me. I cut him off with a smile. Not the kind he was hoping for. The kind that meant he had no idea what was coming next. I walked out of that bar without looking back. My hands were shaking, but I wasn't sad. I wasn't heartbroken. I was furious. Ilya thought this was a moment of confession, a way to clear his conscience. But he didn't realize something. This wasn't his redemption arc. This wasn't his story anymore. It was mine. I barely slept that night. My mind kept spinning, replaying everything. My father's business, gone. Our family struggles, real. I remembered watching my dad break down, sitting at the kitchen table with stacks of unpaid bills. My mom trying to stay strong, pretending we'd be okay. I had lived through that loss, carried that pain, and all this time, I never knew who was really behind it. Ilya. And now, he was my boss. The next morning, I walked into the office like nothing had changed. If Ilya thought I was going to let this go, he was wrong. I wasn't some naive girl waiting for explanations. I had power now. I had leverage. And most importantly, I had patience. But something was off. The moment I stepped onto my floor, people were whispering, glancing at me, then looking away just as quickly. I ignored it, heading to my desk, but before I could sit, my coworker, Celia, grabbed my arm. Hey, she murmured. You okay? I frowned. Why wouldn't I be? She hesitated, then glanced toward the hallway leading to Ilya's office. My stomach twisted. What happened? Celia bit her lip. I think you should see for yourself. I pushed past her, marching toward the hallway. As I got closer, I heard voices, muffled but tense. A complete violation. Just give me a second. I shoved the door open. Ilya was standing behind his desk, his phone in hand. The second he saw me, his expression shifted. Can we talk in private? His voice was strained. I ignored him and turned to the other person in the room. Annalise. She was just as I remembered, pristine, polished, looking like she walked straight out of a high-end magazine. But there was something else this time. She looked furious. I crossed my arms. What's going on? Annalise turned to me, her lips curling into a sharp, cold smile. I was just asking Ilya the same thing. I raised an eyebrow. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Why are you here, really? Is this some kind of pathetic attempt to get back at him? I almost laughed. Get back at him? If only she knew. I work here, I said coolly. Earn my position. Unlike some people who marry their way to the top. Her eyes flashed. You think you're so clever, don't you? I tilted my head. Well, I don't think you are, if that helps. She inhaled sharply, turning back to Ilya. You need to fix this, she snapped. Now. I'm handling it, he muttered. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Handling what, exactly? Ilya pinched the bridge of his nose. There was a leak. I froze. A leak. Annalise smirked. Oh, she doesn't know? That's rich. I turned to Ilya. Explain. Now. His jaw tightened. Someone sent a confidential email thread to the board. It details some questionable financial practices. My stomach dropped. I wasn't stupid. I knew how these corporations worked. They all had skeletons in their closets. But if someone had sent a leak, and if that someone had dirt on Ilya, that meant. I took a slow breath. And what, exactly, does this email say? Ilya hesitated. Annalise answered for him. It says that the company, his company, is on the verge of collapse. I went still. Wait, I said, my voice quieter now. What? Ilya's shoulders sagged, just for a second. It's not as bad as it sounds. Annalise let out a cruel laugh. Oh, really? Because the board is already talking about pushing you out. I looked at him carefully. He didn't deny it. I thought back to last night. The desperation in his voice, the way he said he made a mistake. I thought it was about me. But no. Ilya wasn't just trying to confess his sins. He was trying to save himself. I swallowed. Who leaked the email? Silence. Then Annalise smiled, really smiled, like she had been waiting for this moment. Oh, that's the best part, she said, voice dripping with satisfaction. The email came from your department. I felt like the floor had just dropped out from under me. Ilya's eyes were locked on me now. Did you? I scoffed. You think I did this? Annalise let out a laugh. Who else would? You waltz back into his life and suddenly everything falls apart. I took a step forward, ignoring her completely. I looked Ilya right in the eyes. I didn't send that email. But you have bigger problems than me. He exhaled sharply. Yeah, no kidding. Annalise stepped between us, her voice saccharine sweet. I'd be careful if I were you, she murmured. Because whether you sent it or not, you're the perfect scapegoat. I smiled. That would only work if I let you pin it on me. She leaned in slightly. Do you really want to go up against me? I didn't even blink. I don't know, Annalise. Do you? A flicker of something crossed her face. Just for a second. Then she straightened, smoothing her perfectly tailored blazer. We'll see. She turned to Ilya. Fix this. Now. Then she walked out, her heels clicking against the floor like gunshots. Ilya ran a hand down his face, sighing. I swear, I didn't think this could get worse. I crossed my arms. Oh, this is just the beginning. His gaze flickered to mine, something uncertain in his expression. You're really not behind this? I stared at him. You really don't know me at all, do you? Silence. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then swore under his breath. What? I asked. He looked at me, his face pale. The board just called an emergency meeting. He swallowed. They want me out. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I was smiling. Because for the first time in 10 years, Ilya Whitmore was finally losing everything. Ilya ran a hand through his hair, his breathing unsteady. I could see it now, that split second of real fear in his eyes. The same man who once left me shattered was now standing in front of me, watching his carefully constructed life crumble. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. The email leak wasn't just a minor scandal, it was a death sentence for him. If the board was already calling an emergency meeting, they weren't giving him time to explain. They were planning to cut him out tonight. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to stop them. But something didn't add up. If the leak came from my department, that meant someone wanted me involved. Someone wanted to tie me to this. And that someone wasn't Ilya. I watched as he started pacing. He pulled his phone out, probably trying to reach one of his contacts on the board, but his hands were shaking. I had seen this man hold entire rooms hostage with nothing but his voice, his presence. But now, he was drowning. Who benefits from this? I asked. He stopped mid-step, looking at me. I shrugged. You built this company. If you go down, who steps in? He swallowed. There's only one person. I didn't even have to ask. We both knew the answer. Annalise. Her father had handpicked Ilya for this job. Married her off to him. Groomed him into the perfect successor for their empire. But that wasn't enough, was it? He was never truly one of them. He was just borrowed power. And now, they were taking it back. My stomach twisted as the realization settled. I had spent years thinking about Ilya as the villain in my story, and maybe he had been. But this was bigger. I need to see that email, I said. Ilya hesitated, then pulled his phone out, scrolling through. He turned the screen toward me. The second I read the email, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just financial corruption. It wasn't just questionable business practices. This was fraud on a massive scale. This was criminal. If the board went public with this, Ilya wouldn't just lose his company. He'd be investigated. Maybe even arrested. And whoever leaked this, they didn't just want him fired. They wanted him destroyed. I let out a slow breath. You said it came from my department. He nodded. Then someone is trying to frame me, I muttered. A realization hit me. This wasn't just about Ilya. This was about taking me down with him. My stomach clenched. I knew Annalise hated me. But this was calculated. You need to go, I said suddenly. Ilya blinked. What? I stepped closer, lowering my voice. If they see you talking to me right now, it makes us both look guilty. For once, he didn't argue. He gave me one last unreadable look before slipping out of the office. I exhaled sharply, trying to think. Who in my department would do this? I had kept my head down at this job. I did my work. I never got caught up in office politics. But clearly, someone had been watching me. I walked back to my desk, my pulse pounding. Celia looked up from her computer, concern etched on her face. Are you okay? She asked quietly. I hesitated. Did you hear who sent the email? She glanced around before lowering her voice. IT is still checking, but I heard a rumor. I leaned in. Who? She swallowed. Bennett. My stomach dropped. Bennett was my closest colleague. We had worked on almost every major project together. I had trusted him. I felt cold all over. Why would Bennett do this? I forced a tight smile. Thanks. Then I turned on my heel and marched straight to his desk. He looked up as I approached, a mask of innocence on his face. Hey, what's up? I sat down across from him, keeping my expression unreadable. The email leak. Your name came up. His face didn't even flicker. I watched him carefully. Tell me the truth. Did you send it? Bennett sighed dramatically. Look, I know how this looks. But I swear I had nothing to do with it. I studied him. His voice was steady, his expression open. But something wasn't right. You've always hated Ilya, I said slowly. He smirked. Well, yeah. But that doesn't mean I'd risk my job. I didn't believe him. Something in my gut told me he was lying. And then, as if the universe wanted to confirm my suspicion, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I glanced down at the screen. Unknown number. I wouldn't trust Bennett if I were you. I felt my breath hitch. I looked up at him again, this time seeing him differently. If Bennett wasn't working alone, then who the hell was he working for? I stood abruptly. Thanks, Bennett. His smile faltered just slightly. I turned and walked away, my mind racing. And then another text came through. Unknown number. You're in the middle of something bigger than you realize. Meet me tonight. Alone. My heart pounded. I had two options. 1, I could ignore the message and focus on clearing my name. 2, I could go and finally find out the truth. I didn't even hesitate. I texted back. Where? I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding. Unknown number. You're in the middle of something bigger than you realize. Meet me tonight. Alone. I should have ignored it. Every instinct told me this was dangerous, reckless. But I couldn't. Not when I was already standing in the middle of the storm. Not when someone had clearly been pulling strings behind the scenes, waiting for the right moment to strike. I texted back. Where? A few seconds later, the reply came. Old train station. 10 p.m. Come alone. I exhaled slowly, gripping my phone tighter. The abandoned train station on the outskirts of the city. Of course it had to be a place straight out of a crime thriller. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not Celia. Not even Ilya. I needed to hear the truth for myself, without distractions. By the time I arrived, the night air was cold, thick with tension. The station was exactly as I remembered it, crumbling bricks, rusted tracks, the faint smell of old rain soaking into wood. My heels clicked against the pavement as I stepped forward, scanning the shadows. Then a figure emerged. Bennett. My heart dropped into my stomach. He leaned against one of the pillars, watching me with an expression that was almost amused. So you actually came, he said, pushing off the wall. I kept my voice steady. Why am I here, Bennett? He sighed, tilting his head. I gotta admit, I thought you'd be smarter than this. I clenched my fists. Cut the cryptic bullshit. Did you leak the email? He let out a low chuckle. You still don't get it, do you? I took a step closer. What the hell is going on? And then a new voice cut through the air. You were never supposed to be involved. I turned sharply. Annalise. She stepped out from the darkness, her movements slow, deliberate. The glow from a street lamp caught her face, making her expression look even sharper, colder. I swallowed. So it was you. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, sweetheart. Of course it was me. I felt something deep in my gut twist. Why? Annalise's gaze flickered with something unreadable. Because I was tired of pretending. Bennett stepped beside her, slipping his hands into his pockets. I told you. This was never about you. I clenched my jaw. Then why frame me? Annalise's smirk faded. Because you were in the way. The weight of her words settled heavily between us. You were never supposed to come back, she said quietly. You were supposed to be some forgotten, insignificant high school memory. But then you had to walk into that meeting. You had to remind him. I frowned. Remind him of what? She inhaled sharply. That he loved you. My chest tightened. Her lips curled into a sneer. You should have seen him after that meeting. The way he looked at me like I was just some obstacle now. The way he... She cut herself off, inhaling sharply before regaining control. You were always his biggest mistake. I swallowed back the lump in my throat. So you what? Destroyed him? She tilted her head. I gave him exactly what he worked for. A rise to the top, and a very public, very humiliating fall. He was never going to be one of us. He was a pet project. And once my father saw that he was more trouble than he was worth, well, she waved a dismissive hand. It was time to put him down. The words should have made me feel victorious. I had spent years resenting Ilya, hating him for what he did. But now, standing here, listening to her say it, all I felt was rage. She didn't do this out of justice. She didn't do this because Ilya deserved to fall. She did it because she wanted to own him. I took a slow step forward, my voice steady. And Bennett? Bennett exhaled dramatically. I'm just the guy who made sure things ran smoothly. I shook my head. No, you're the guy who betrayed a friend for a paycheck. His smirk faltered, just slightly. You don't get it, he said. This isn't about you or Ilya. This is how the world works. People like you? You think if you work hard enough, play by the rules, you'll win. But the truth is, the game was never meant for people like us. You either play dirty, or you get buried. I let out a slow breath. You're right about one thing, I murmured. He raised an eyebrow. I smiled. I was never supposed to be involved. And then I pulled my phone out and hit send. The audio file I had been recording the second I stepped out of my car, it went straight to every major news outlet in the city. Bennett's smirk disappeared instantly. Annalise's expression darkened. You little, I held up a hand. Careful. Every word you say now? It's public record. She inhaled sharply, fury twisting her features. But she wasn't stupid. She knew there was no getting out of this. You think this will ruin me? She hissed. I have power. I tilted my head. So did Ilya. Look where he is now. Bennett turned to her. Annalise, we need to leave. She ignored him, stepping closer to me. You have no idea what you've just done. I smiled. I know exactly what I've done. And then sirens filled the night air. The second they heard the recording, the board hadn't just fired Ilya. They had launched an investigation. And when an investigation involves millions of dollars in fraud, people get arrested. Bennett turned pale. Annalise clenched her fists so hard her nails dug into her palms. This isn't over, she whispered. I stepped back, watching as the squad cars pulled in, red and blue lights bouncing off the cracked pavement. You're right, I said softly. It's just starting. Ilya left the company. Not that he had much of a choice. With everything that came out, his name was too tainted to recover. But he wasn't in prison. Annalise and her father took the fall. She never spoke to him again. The last time I saw him was months later. He stood outside my building, hands in his pockets, looking lost. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said. But I needed to say it. I'm sorry. I watched him for a long moment. Then I nodded. Not because it made everything okay, but because I was done carrying him with me. I turned and walked away. And this time, he didn't chase me.